Stories of sunken cities and lost utopias, both real and legendary, have proliferated cultures all around the world. But could one of these legendary cities have actually existed? Thousands of people have spent generations trying to find lost cities mentioned in ancient texts. Sometimes, like with Troy, the hunt proves successful. Others, like Atlantis, even though it's an allegory, still inspire expeditions and theories. India also has a story of a legendary ancient city, blessed and bestowed by a god that was swallowed by the waves. Today, we are diving into the hunt for and the potential archaeological evidence we have of Dvaraka, Krishna's sunken city. Could it really have existed? Welcome back to Dig It with Raven. Let's get into it. The ancient city of Dvaraka is not to be confused with the modern city of Dwarka, located in the Indian state of Gujarat on the western shore of the Oka Mandal Peninsula at the mouth of the Gulf of Kutch. Though, as we'll soon see, they are closely related to one another. Dvaraka, also known as Dvaravati, the gated city, was said to be a sacred historic site built by Krishna, a major deity in the Hindu religion. The city itself is mentioned in the sacred literature of the Hindu, Jain, and Buddhist religions. The name Dvaraka possibly means, quote, having too many gates. If we break the word down, Dvar means doorway and Ka means eternal bliss. So, according to the myths surrounding the city, Dvaraka was a place where one could achieve such bliss, and it is one of the 7 sacred sites of Hinduism. According to tradition and ancient religious texts, Dvaraka was built by Krishna near modern Dwarka, which was formerly called Kushasthali, an old city that had fallen into ruin. The main texts where this city is mentioned are the Mahabharata, the Sanskrit epic of 200,000 lines that narrates the events and aftermath of the Kurukshetra War, written between the 3rd century BCE and the 3rd century CE, the Harivamsha, which is essentially an appendix to the Mahabharata, written between the 2nd century BCE and the 5th century CE, and the Puranas, which are a vast genre of Indian literature that cover a wide range of topics and tend to be accounts of soft traditions and legends passed down from generation to generation and date to about the 3rd to 10th century CE. Dvaraka is also mentioned in early Tamil works such as the Nalayira Divya Prabandham, dating from the 4th to 9th century CE, and the Silapakataram, dating from the 5th to 6th centuries CE. From all of these texts, the Mahabharata is the oldest and appears to hold quite a lot of historical and geographical information. It's even been described to be quite encyclopedic in its nature. Now, with all of that intro out of the way, let's dive into the myth itself. The Bhagavata Purana describes Dvaraka as a city filled with the sound of birds and bees flying about the parks and pleasure gardens. It boasted 900,000 royal palaces, all constructed with crystal and silver, and splendorously decorated with huge emeralds. Inside these palaces, the furnishings were bedecked with gold and jewels. Traffic moved along a well-laid-out system of boulevards, roads, intersections, and marketplaces, and many assembly houses and temples of demigods graced the charming city. The roads, courtyards, commercial streets, and residential patios were all sprinkled with water and shaded from the sun's head by banners waving from flagpoles. The description goes on to mention beautiful private quarters and 16,000 palaces for Krishna's queens, one supported by coral pillars inlaid with gems and sapphires bedecking the walls. Precious jewels and pearls and peacocks were everywhere. Other sources, like the Sri Harivamsha, describe it as filled with beautiful men and women, traders, and various articles of merchandise. Although it was established on Earth, it appeared like one ranging in the sky. That city was filled with the noise of people hailing from various kingdoms of Earth, and the air was saturated with the water of the waves of the ocean. Essentially, if you can dream up any sort of opulence, Dvarka probably had it. On top of that, it was also a well-infrastructured city with a road system, high buildings that almost touched the sky, impenetrable defensive walls, and several sacred temples. There is also the offshore island of Bet Dwarka, 30 kilometers north of the modern city, that is said to have been Krishna's pleasure resort. Dvaraka was supposedly a prosperous port city, and it's theorized it was used to trade with the African coast, Arabian Gulf, and further north. It would have been the gateway to India from the west. Of all this, Krishna was king, as he appeared in the Mahabharata. The Salwa kingdom is said to have attacked Dvaraka, surrounding the city with infantry and destroying all of the nice parks, city gates, and palaces, but it did not bring the city's ruin. It still prospered and was just this glorious, amazing place, the place of epics, essentially, such as in the Mahabharata. But all good and prosperous things must come to an end. It is said that when Krishna decided to depart from the earth, the powerful, dark-bodied Kali Age of vice, descended. The oceans rose and submerged the whole of Dwarka. A more detailed description of the flooding comes from the Mahabharata. The sea, which had been beating against the shores, suddenly broke the boundary that was imposed on it by nature. The sea rushed into the city. It coursed through the streets of the beautiful city. The sea covered up everything in the city. I saw the beautiful buildings become submerged one by one. In a matter of a few moments, it was all over. The sea had now become placid as a lake. There was no trace of the city. Dvarka was just a name, just a memory. But don't worry, according to the story, the inhabitants of Dvarka were given ample notice of this flood and had lots of time to evacuate the city. Everyone just very casually walked out of Dvarka, and there were no casualties. Of course, all of these numbers and exaggerations must be taken with a grain of salt, especially if we're trying to determine if the city actually existed. 900,000 palaces is maybe just a little much, in my opinion, for the area that it was supposed to cover. So let's look at the historical and archaeological evidence that we might have for Dvarka. As I stated earlier, Dvarka is mentioned in the Mahabharata, which traditionally dates to around 3100 BCE, but this date is not established by any archaeological or historical evidence. Rather, this is the date of the legendary Kurukshetra War, which is the main focus of the text. The exact date for when the war took place is disputed among historians, but most people place it later in time, around 1500 BCE. Because there is the modern city of Dwarka that is located in Okamandala in the district of Jamnagar, this is where people have naturally gravitated to as the site of the ancient city. Dvaraka is sometimes compared to Atlantis, or called the Atlantis of India, because it is also an ancient city that was God-blessed and then submerged underwater. But unlike Plato's Atlantis, which never existed, it's actually quite possible that Dvarka did, and one archaeologist even claims to have found it. Let's look at the evidence. Most ancient texts refer to ancient Dvaraka being close to the sea, and the Puranas specifically mention it hugged the west coast where the Gomati River meets the sea. Given that the name does mean door or gate, this makes sense, as an ancient port city would have been the gateway into India. Conversely, the city would have been the gateway to the rest of the world. This, plus the description for the land around Dvaraka given in the Mahabharata and Harivamsha, with its copper-red sand and thorny bushes, all point to the modern city of Dwarka being the likely location for the ancient city of Dvaraka. The search for physical evidence of a submerged Dvaraka began in the 1930s, but the first archaeological excavations took place in 1963 by Hasmukh D. Sankalia with a team from Deccan College. They excavated a trench not far from Dwarkadish Temple on mainland modern Dwarka. This investigation showed that there was a fort wall and a possible water channel. The archaeologists came to the conclusion that the foundation for the first iteration of Dwarka might date to around the beginning of the Christian era, or 2,000 years ago. The next excavations took place between 1979 and 1980 at Dwarkadish Temple. This temple dates from the 13th to 15th centuries CE, but archaeologists found 3 other temples dating to the 1st, 4th, and 9th centuries CE. Under these, around 10 meters deep, were highly eroded deposits and some lustrous redware dated to the 15th to 12th centuries BCE. When archaeologists see this type of pottery in the archaeological record in Gujarat, this is usually a marker for the post-urban Harappan time period, which dates from around 1900 to 1400 BCE, based on radiocarbon dating. Late Harappan ware was also found during these excavations, and there is evidence that a proto-historic settlement from the 16th century BCE was destroyed by sea at this site. There's then a gap in occupation of about 1,000 years before it was again prosperous in the 1st century BCE, and we see lots of painted plainwares, shell bangles, and metal objects. Alternating stratigraphic layers of sand and traces of habitation also suggest that during the 1st millennium BCE, the township was destroyed more than once by storm waves. At least 3 times, actually, between the 16th century BCE and the 2nd century CE. These discoveries led to some scholars hypothesizing that this destroyed settlement was the original city that was the inspiration, if not the actual sunken city itself, of Krishna. These finds near the temple were enough reason to organize further onshore and nearshore underwater excavations in the 1980s to find Krishna's mythological opulent Dvarka. But India had a problem. You see, India didn't have any underwater archaeologists. The field didn't yet exist in that country. But with Dvarka being such a potentially important site for the country, Indian archaeologists were trained to dive and in underwater excavation techniques. This whole venture was led by archaeologist S.R. Rao and was funded by the Indian Science Academy and Department of Science and Technology, with logistical support from the National Institute of Oceanography. Archaeological work first began in 1982 on the island of Bet Dwarka, and based on some very promising data, the first marine archaeological expedition took place off of the island in 1983, alongside some onshore digging. Archaeologists uncovered evidence of submerged buildings, which prompted further underwater missions over a larger area. A survey conducted along the coastline of the southern part of the eastern shore of the island revealed remnants of a massive rubble wall. Pottery collected here was dated using thermoluminescence to around 3,520 years before present, which is around the 16th century BCE. Late Indus seals were also found, which Rao claims corroborates with the statement from the Mahabharata that seals were used by citizens of Dvarka. Some people have called this the world's first passport system because, allegedly, no one was permitted in or out without an identifying seal. Traces of an early settlement were also found in the central region on the eastern shore, also in the form of a massive rubble wall that was exposed during low tide. 9 courses of masonry were found, and to the south were 2 rock-cut slipway-like features that were probably used for launching boats. A further wall-like structure was found submerged in an area further north in Balapur Bay, around 1 kilometer out to sea. All of these structural remains led archaeologists to suggest that an ancient port town, about 4 kilometers long and 0.5 to 1 kilometer wide, existed in the area, with 3 distinct areas on the eastern coast of the island. Rao identified the island of Bet Dvarka as Kushasthali, a place mentioned in the Mahabharata near where Krishna chose to build Dvarka. The reasoning was that the location and the physical features of Bet Dvarka corresponded to those of the site in the written text. For example, the 30 to 40 meter high terraced and wooded hill on the island supposedly represents the Raivataka hill referred to in the epic. The fort wall along the eastern shore and the submerged walls in the sea were also said to confirm that the name that was given to Dvarka in the Mahabharata, quote, citadel of water was appropriate. While this can be interpreted as quite a significant correlation and a decent amount of evidence, this may have been a bit preemptive, scientifically speaking. Such preliminary findings are not enough evidence to definitively point to what exactly this place was, or what it was even called. I'm not saying it completely discounts the possibility, but we do see this sort of thing happen, especially with important religious or mythological sites where locating them would mean a significant deal to a lot of people. Artifacts found in this initial investigation suggest that the site was settled around 1800 BCE in the late Harappan period. Thermoluminescence dating on pottery found on the island during expeditions undertaken more recently show that there was a continuous habitation from the late Harappan period until the medieval period. So given that, I wouldn't say that it was completely destroyed and swallowed by the sea in ancient times. Would you? There would, of course, be rising and falling sea levels that the inhabitants would have had to contend with, but perhaps not complete submersion, like the legends of Dvaraka say. Further excavations took place between 1983 and 1994, particularly around the mainland, and many objects and structures were found, like stone and iron anchors, buildings, metal artifacts, gateways, bastions, fort walls, and mooring stations. Evidence of town planning was noticeable, and some of the structures were found buried under sand. These were confirmed to be the ruins of a port city that once stood at the mouth of the Gomati River. Rao identified it as Dvarka, Krishna's sunken city. Let's dive in to the details of this port city. Archaeologists found inner and outer fortification walls with multiple gates and remains of a stone jetty. An outer gate led out to the sea, while an inner one led out to the Gomati. The outer walls were made with large dressed stone blocks and remain in situ up to 1 to 2 meters in height. Large dressed sandstone blocks were also used to create multiple rectangular enclosures that could have been part of port structures. The use of massive blocks with L-shaped joints would have aided in deflecting the battering from waves and currents, and, if we're looking at scripture, 6 fortified enclosures were identified that Rao claims to corroborate the description found in the Skanda Purana. Circular bastions were built around corners to protect constructs from the impact of the sea, and smaller stones that were identified to have been used in structures were also found, but they were quite far spread out thanks to the current. A few large houses and a couple of public buildings were also said to have been identified. There was also said to be evidence for a stone-paved street and 2 stone-built drains, a temple that would have had a very heavy door by looking at its sockets, and wells that were allegedly also mentioned in the Harivamsha. The stone anchors I mentioned earlier were triangular in shape and had 3 holes. They were found lying along these walls and were said to confirm that there was a harbor area that was used for anchoring and docking boats, and that Dvarka was a major port on the Gujarat coast that had important commercial and administrative institutions. The anchors were also said to be similar to ones used at the late Bronze Age sites of Kition and in Syria from the 14th to 12th centuries BCE. Rao believed that the remains found belonged to 2 distinct periods of habitation. The first period was quite short, between 1500 BCE and 1400 BCE, and correlates to the second urbanization period of India. And this is supposedly when Dvarka was built. This period is when the lustrous redware pottery that was found at the temple in modern Dwarka and also at Bet Dwarka would have been made. The structures of this second urbanization period were the ones that Rao identified as being in situ about 6 meters below sea level. The second period of habitation lasted from circa 100 BCE to 500 CE. These dates were based on the analysis of red polished wares and other associated pottery found in this section of the site, which was in situ about 2.82 meters below sea level. This is the period where the iron anchors that were found dated to. All of this initial work was done 30 plus years ago, and in the time since, some new things have come to light. Unfortunately, the claims that the general layout of the city that was described in the ancient text matched the archaeological finds has been called into question with more recent work done in the area. In particular, Rayo's dating of the underwater remains to the 16th century BCE because there wasn't a significant amount of lustrous redware pottery found, and the triangular stone anchors, first believed to belong to the first habitation period, have been examined and determined to be medieval in age. Furthermore, newer studies of the underwater remains have proven that none of the structures were residential. They almost all exclusively belong to a stone jetty. So it looks like we don't have as old a settlement as Rayo initially concluded. Sure, the area was definitely inhabited by a community of people. There was indeed an ancient settlement that was eventually destroyed by the sea. That part of the legendary story appears to be real, and if there is any historical truth to Krishna's legendary building of the city, this would date the god and the Kurukshetra war to the middle of the 2nd millennium BCE. These new excavations at Dwarka began in 2007 alongside work at other sites along the Gujarati coast, and investigations both on-site and post-excavation work continue to this day. Other than what I've already discussed earlier, nothing has yet come out proving that Dwarka was at any point suddenly swallowed by the sea in a matter of days. It's impossible that the rising of the global sea level would have swallowed the port city that quickly. That's not to say that sea levels haven't changed over time, though. We have the archaeological proof that they did, and scientific investigations have proven that sea levels have indeed risen over time. Rayo calculated that in the last 3,300 years, the level has risen between 5 and 6 meters. But other investigations have shown that during that time in that area, the sea level has risen and fallen many times. The current level that the sea is at today dates to 1000 CE. All of this change is due to the natural ebb and flow of the sea and changes to the environment. There is also the factor of coastal erosion, for which Dwarka is such a victim. So, given all of this evidence, the site of present-day Dwarka does indeed seem to be the most likely candidate for Krishna's legendary sunken city. But did it actually exist? I think it might be safe to say that there was indeed a port city on ancient Dwarka and habitation on Bet Dwarka. It probably, definitely, wasn't this holy god-touched place reminiscent of Atlantis. Rather, we can best compare it to the site of Troy. Legends and epics have been written with both cities as major players, but with added mythology. Troy existed. We have confirmation of this. I've dug there, but there is no evidence for such a massive 10-year war that razed the city to the ground. Troy continued well into the Roman period, even after multiple attacks. Given that, we can look at Dvarka in a similar light. People lived there. There appears to be international contact according to Rayo. It may have thrived, but archaeologically speaking, it was not suddenly destroyed by a flood when a deity decided to leave it. Myths are defined as traditional stories that often concern the early history of a people or explain a natural or social phenomenon. They can be beliefs widely held by a community and also typically involve supernatural beings or events. Time and again, there are usually both factual and non-factual forces that influence these tales. By looking at the archaeological evidence of Dvaraka, along with the many writings that speak of it, I think we can see how these two factors contribute to something much larger and culturally important than either individual element ever could. So, I've given you all of the evidence, I've read all of the archaeological reports so you don't have to. Let me know in the comments, what do you think? Did Dvarka exist? Could the modern city of Dwarka be the location for this sunken city? Or is it like Atlantis? And are we still going to be hunting for it forever? Thanks so much for watching, everyone. If you liked the video, you know what to do. Smash the like, smash the subscribe button. Big thank you to all of my patrons over on Patreon. If you like the channel and you want to help support the channel so I can continue making these videos, head on over to Patreon and become a patron. You get early access and you can sometimes even get to choose what I put out next. As always, stay dirty, my friends.